Welcome, everyone. My name's Summer. I'm one of the authors of the book, Whiteness Is Not an Ancestor, and I'm just here to support with Zoom today. So if you have questions, you can chat those in the chat box, and I'll be monitoring that. And we also have a Q&A. So if you have questions that we'll kind of go through at the very end, you can put them in the Q&A box. And it is my pleasure to welcome Gretchen Schmelzer. She is a licensed psychologist and a trauma survivor who has worked for 25 years with the complex issues of trauma, integration, and behavior change across every level, from individuals to groups to large systems to countries. And she's been a senior consultant with the Telios Leadership Institute, an international consulting firm serving leaders of Fortune 100 businesses and major not-for-profit organizations such as the United Nations. She is the founder and editor of The Trail Guide, a web mag featured on GretchenSmelzer.com, dedicated to healing repeated trauma, and the author of the book Journey Through Trauma. And thanks, Gretchen, for leading the conversation today.
Thank you, Summer. I'm so glad to be here to talk about the book Whiteness Is Not an Ancestor, and to be supporting a conversation between the authors and editor of this book. It's a groundbreaking beginning conversation, I would say, that needs to happen. And the writers of the essays really were courageous in beginning and showing us the way of how to have these conversations. And so I'm really excited to be part of this conversation. And I want to begin by asking Lisa Iversen, who is the editor of the book, what is the origin and focus of the book?
Well, before I answer that, I have to echo the thanks for you being with us, Gretchen. It's really, you're just right to be here with us. We really appreciate it. So the origin is, the fast track is, I've been a psychotherapist for almost 30 years, and the last 20 plus, I've been specializing in an approach called family constellations or systemic constellations. That approach developed in Germany over 30 years ago by a man named Bert Hellinger. Many other approaches that led to this development that he offered the world. And so the last 20 plus years of my work, I just have been steeped in this field of intergenerational, multi-generational family blueprints. And the constellation work developed on German soil post-Holocaust era. So the trauma of the Holocaust was fresh in the influence of that modality. And so for me, when I began learning that approach, it just set me on a course of really thinking about the collective trauma for my home country, which is the US. So it's been a 20 plus years field of my daily awareness. It's become a daily thing for me for many years, that I'm with just the facts of the history of this country and the field of connection between individual and family and national history. Yeah. So that set me on a course with work that led to this project. I'm good that you asked me more questions to kind of dive me specifically here. Yep.
Right. Well, so you have this history in doing constellations work. Yep. How have that work guided you in this country?
Well,
so what have you done here?
Yeah, well, so in this country, I've just been leading groups for many years, for 20 plus years, that the awareness and the influence of national history has just been with me in all the work that I do with people. So, you know, that's filled with trauma, and
Right.
it's filled with experience of, you know, one people taking something from another people. And so whiteness has had everything to do with the movements of colonialism and slavery that are foundational to the origins of the US. And so those histories led me to the experience of having, over the years, several fine people, including this group of dozen women, who about a year ago, Sonya invited me to her region where she lives to offer a workshop. And while I was there, during the dream time, it was about a year ago, and it was when the veil's very thin, our Halloween era. And this dream emerged for this project. And I woke up one morning with the idea of inviting this very specific group of women together for this writing project.
So can you talk a little bit about the women who contributed to these essays?
Yeah, they all have had quite a lot of experience with the constellation method. Some of them are facilitators and teachers in this field. And I know them all well. And some are good friends. And because I knew them well, I knew that they had this embodied sense of history, not only their own individual and family lives, but in connection with these larger histories around, you know, how countries are formed and collective historic traumas and the field of whiteness. So I knew they each had a capacity for talking and writing about this topic. And I just see over and over how much we miss the fact that family is where our humanity begins, and how important that is, more than ever, more than ever. So I knew that this group of women, you know, had a capacity to speak about their own lives and histories that are difficult ones to talk about and to write about in a way that would be really a gift for so many other people.
Right. The word that comes to mind is crucible, that this family crucible that we're formed in. When you were talking, I was resonating. I grew up in a family that had a grandfather that fought in World War II. And then I was an exchange student in Germany during the year that was the 50th anniversary of the Magdeburg-Reifung, Hitler's rise to power. And sort of the experience of trying to hold in my 17-year-old head the expanse of history and the amount of trauma that I knew from my family growing up, and then their world. It's hard to hold it all, or it's hard to make meaning of it. And I think this is where we need these narratives, or like the ability to attempt a coherent narrative over and over and over again, right? So I think that there's such a gift in helping other people get to hear it, and asking this group of women to kind of forge ahead on this. The only thing I want to ask you before we move on is, for people out there who don't know what constellations is, could you do a little bit of description of that so they can understand?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, well, the word constellation, you know, we tend to think about the arrangement of the stars in the sky. Constellation in this context, family constellation, it has to do with the arrangement of people throughout our generational history, and that we are all in connection with one another. There's that families are a system, generationally so, and that what happens earlier in the generations affects us today. So it was developed as a group modality It's adaptable for individual consultation as well. But
Yeah.
it really immediately makes visible that for me, what I would say as an American is that we're not as original as we think that we are. And that it's not all about us.
Right.
So I do want to say that as an American, I think it's really important that we see that the country was founded out of disconnection from family.
Mm-hmm.
So those three fields of historic movements, of colonialism and of immigration and of slavery, all involve disconnection from family. And so that, again, this group of women, they, because of who they are, their own lives past, their intentionality around stewarding their own consciousness, I think their essays just so powerfully make visible that we are not as, our individual sense of who we are exists, and it's absolutely in connection with family, and that the things that have been difficult in family life, that we can go toward them in a way that's restorative for the present and for the future.
Right. So figuring out how to stay connected to some things and understanding how we're disconnected as well.
Exactly, right? Exactly. And that there's an enormous power and gift from being able to expand our capacity for acknowledging the truth, for acknowledging what is.
Right.
And, that's, that it's restorative and strengthening to do so. And that we need each other in order to do that. Because, in the US, we focus on the individual. In the Western world, the Western trained mind focuses so very heavily on the individual.
Right.
So these are group tasks. It was really clear, I'm committed to group work for all the reasons we're talking about, but with this project, it was really clear from the beginning. When we gathered, I invited all these great women and I said, hey, do you want to do this? And they said, yes. We began the project. We did it, and we did the writing in 10 weeks. It was a pretty quick start.
Yeah,
and we started, and then COVID started, and the last day of finishing was the day that George Floyd was murdered.
Right.
It just happened that way. And the first meeting we had, it was clear, white and deconstructing whiteness. It's a group project.
Right. Well, when I talk about repeated trauma in my work, most repeated traumas are repeated relational traumas. And what was hurt in relationship must be mended in relationship. It is impossible to heal alone from a relational trauma, from my vantage point anyway. And so, the work that we're talking about, the racial trauma, the relational trauma, colonial trauma, has to be healed in connection, in community, in order for it to actually work its way into that level of system. So one other piece is just that the bringing together of narratives allows the whole trauma story to come out. So there's the beauty in some ways of people being home from COVID and the work that has been done around anti-Black racism in this country. Mm-hmm. There's been a lot of narratives that have come out, right? Mm-hmm. And I think in order, this came out during the apartheid Truth and Reconciliation process, but there can't just be the voices of the people who've been harmed. The voice of the perpetrator and the voices of the people who have done the harming have got to come out as well for the whole story to happen and for the integration that you talk about. So I think the essays in this book talk on a wide range of different aspects of colonial experience, of race experience, but all about holding both, holding my history, holding our history, and trying to sort that through. So I think it's going to be time to bring in the writers.
Yes, great. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah. So Sonya and Una both wrote beautiful essays for this book. I'm going to ask each of them to talk about what they wrote so that you guys out there listening can have a sense. And then what they did to prepare, what it made it possible to write this piece of work, and how it connects to them, their whiteness, their life, however they hold their piece. And Sonya, I'll start with you.
Sure, thank you. Thank you very much. In 1936, in Owensboro, Kentucky, which was the town that I was born in, Rainey Bethia, a young Black man, was jailed for the rape and murder of an elderly white woman. And he was then tried by, I'm making the story very, very short. He was then tried by an all-male, all-white jury that took 4.5 minutes to convict him. But they dropped out the murder charge so that they could try him for rape. And what that meant in Kentucky at that time was a public hanging in the town square. I learned about this event 18 years ago at my paternal grandmother's funeral, when a neighbor came along and handed me an oral interview with my grandma Ralph. Up until that point, I knew nothing about this in history. I didn't have any awareness of it. So what I was experiencing of the event was directly in her very violent, very racist words about her and my grandfather's participation when they were 1 week after their wedding and just teenagers. So Rainey Bethia was hanged on the banks of the Ohio. There were 20,000 white people in attendance. Journalists came from everywhere. You can, if you look this up, you can see this reported in so many different places. The legal definitions at the time were to call it a public execution because he was tried. It is still to this day called a public execution. There's no awareness of the lack of justice, the injustice as a way of covering the event. But what happened was, with that many people, as you can imagine, there was people were sleeping on the streets. It was kind of this picnic carnival atmosphere. Owensboro, Kentucky was condemned in the media. And it was a very harsh experience for them. And then they, I think it was within about a year, they turned over the ability to publicly hang. That was the last public execution in America, was in my hometown. So 18 years ago, when I received this, that was a lot to take in. There was a lot to process. I wasn't where I am right now in relationship to that work, but I did start to try and do the work of trying to find the people who had researched it, trying to understand the historical approach of it. And what I learned is that it had, at that time, what I knew was that it was only really covered by white historians out for review. And even in anniversary stories, 75-year anniversary stories in the New York Times, by NPR, will only take the white historian points of view. So I really felt it was necessary to look at what is the Black historian's approach to this work, and what would this event look like if we took the cameras and instead of focusing, as we often do, on the victim, what if we turned the cameras around and looked at the perpetrators? What if we looked at our own whiteness? And so I would say most of the time that I've spent researching and being with this work has been about looking at my own whiteness at the same time as I've been researching and trying to understand what happened, trying to fit in other historical perspectives.
Yeah. You, in your essay, you quote Justice Marion Buller, and you talk about the idea of rebuilding instead of reconciliation.
Yes.
And the sort of this idea of, you know, it would be a process. It would be a series of things that would have to happen. It's not just a one and done. You don't just reconcile or walk away or say we're fine or I'm sorry. And I'm wondering how that process has been for you. Like, what parts of rebuilding have you experienced?
That's such a good question. First of all, I want to acknowledge Canada for that perspective. I live in Canada, I grew up in Canada. Canada has although it might be flawed, they have a truth and reconciliation process. It was Tanya Talaga who brought that information forward, one of our great Indigenous leaders in Canada. So I think that rebuilding means that we have to be able to be on an equal footing. So for example, in order to think about things like bringing pipelines in, we have to understand that there's a whole Indigenous perspective and Indigenous way of land management that's been there prior to anything that colonialized thought wants to do in relationship to resources. In relationship to my work, I would have to say it's been a really complicated process. I think that one of the benefits of working with Lisa and doing embodied work is it really slowed me down. My tendency would be to write a really great paper and, and put everything out there that I knew. But doing the embodied work really made me be with the trauma and experience it in a way that I hadn't been able to, and really look at what is this perpetrator self? How is it that I, as a white woman, am so comfortable with being in the victim or the rescuer role, but the perpetrator is new to me at the age that I am? Not that it's new in doing it. I was trained in that as a Southern white woman, but really the reckoning with it is, I think, a huge part of understanding how to do rebuilding. I think it begins in an embodied way first, before you can really go to solutioning and saying, what are the things on the checklist that I have to do to get right with this? I wanted to jump right into reparations work and amends work. And that hasn't always been entirely appropriate for me.
Right. Really sitting with the what is, right? Sitting with having to integrate that experience before you can do anything with it.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Right.
And not getting stuck in the shame of it. I mean, I don't want to discourage people who are experiencing that kind of shame. It is a process, and you do experience the shame, but then there are other things that pivot and move you. I love, I think, what Brene Brown talks about when she talks about shame is corrosive to empathy. So, we do have to feel it during certain amounts of time in the process, and then to really be equal, to be able to do a rebuilding process, we have to begin to experience empathy in new ways.
Right. Beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
Una.
Gretchen.
Hi. I'm curious, you're coming with a perspective, your story is about being Swiss, growing up in Switzerland, and so it's a different kind of colonialism or a different kind of power structure. And tell me about how you came to your essay and how did you prepare? What helped you write it?
Well, when Lisa invited me to contribute an essay to this anthology, I had just finished writing a family memoir. So I was immersed already in this victim perpetrator, the issues of that and the conflicting difficulties of that. And I was aware of the difficult but often invisible legacies we inherit from our ancestors.
Yeah.
And for a number of reasons, I actually chose not to include this particular piece in the book. So when Lisa invited me, I thought, okay, this is what I'm going to write about. It's clear. So that's how I came to it. I was born in Switzerland. I have a Swiss mother. I have very strong links to Switzerland. I spent 10 years there. I went to school there in part, but actually I grew up in England. Yeah. So but I have a very, it's interesting what Sonya was just saying about the different pieces. You know, for you, it's Canada and America, and for me, it's Switzerland, Ireland, and England. So trying to kind of, it's like a mosaic, and trying to come to terms with all those three parts of myself and those three different threads of my ancestry. So
yeah, it actually makes me wonder whether the gift of being from seeing the multiple perspectives actually allows you both, but some distance to see the story differently.
Yes, I think it's important to put yourself in the story, and I think that's what we've all done in this. And certainly for me in the beginning, it was difficult to do that. I was aware that I'd left myself out of the story. I didn't talk about myself and how I didn't use the we. And I recognize that's a split that I had growing up, because yeah, my father would always talk about rather negatively about the Swiss. So I kind of distanced myself from being Swiss. I identified more with being English and the sort of more intellectual, sort of charming aspect that my father was, rather than the sort of grounded agrarian people that my mother was. But it's important. So I came to that quite late, actually, in the process. In fact, I would say halfway through the writing, I realized, gosh, you know, I don't use the we, I use they all the time. So to me, that was a very important recognition and realization. Was
it the writing that helped you see that?
No, it was the women who helped me see it, actually. Because when we all came together, when we got the full draft of all the essays, I read them and I was struck by the integrity and the depth and the honesty of the writing. And yeah, I think it was reading them all together, and I thought, gosh, I haven't contributed enough of myself. I haven't admitted the shame of myself in this. So yeah, it was what you were saying, Lisa, about community, and about, you were saying as well, Gretchen, that we have to do this together. And I don't think I could have done it by myself without being part of this group. So
that's such an important point, that this is almost impossible to learn in isolation. Right?
Yeah.
That we really need each other's stories. We need to borrow each other's courage and honesty and integrity, and to build on our own, right? And that what sort of each kind of halting movement we each make allows us to keep going. Is there part of your story you'd be interested in sharing here?
Well, I think briefly, yes. I don't want to spend too much time talking about it, because I think, you know, there are other things that we can talk about as well. But yeah, in 1943, my mother and her family experienced a severe loss from which they never fully recovered. And as a result of that, my mother and my uncle began to acquire gold coins, particularly in an attempt to sort of ward future loss. And similarly, the Swiss government, in its desire to protect its citizens from invasion and from widespread starvation during World War II, took the decision to collude with the Nazis. And 1.7 billion Swiss francs worth of gold, stolen from European national banks and concentration camps, was brought to Switzerland and hidden in the vaults of the National Bank in Bern. So really my story is an overlap between that personal side in my family and what the Swiss did during World War II to stay safe. And in both cases, I think it was really a sense of wanting to protect themselves from loss and wanting to protect their people. And I think it's if we just look at the facts, you know, it's terrible, absolutely unforgivable, the way the Swiss behaved. And of course, in 1996, this was all under the Clinton administration. This was all looked at in New York, and there was 2 years worth of investigations, and the Swiss had to pay reparations. And but it's very easy just to criticize and just to say, this is terrible what they did. And it is terrible what they did. But it's important to look, as in families, why do we behave this way? And why did the Swiss government do this? And they did it to protect their people. So I think if you can look further back, things become more textured. And so yes, it's really about the overlap between the personal and the national in terms of accumulating gold. Yeah.
Right. How do you hold it all?
Yeah.
And hold, a lot of what you're talking about as well, all of you, is identity, right? You have an identity about who I am or who we are, and the stories that you carry about that. And then new data shows up, or you see new data because you're different, or something happens in the environment and you take it in differently, right? So what is the word responsibility keeps coming to mind in these conversations. What is our responsibility now, given the new data, the way in 1996 there was a different responsibility to that data. So I guess my question to all three of you, we have about 15 minutes more for this conversation, is, this was a big piece of learning for everybody. You kind of went off and explored, not like a land, but a depth of something. And I'm wondering what the impact has been on you, each of you, and where are you going with this? Like, how, either where are you going personally, or what might you offer to people who are just at the beginning of this journey for themselves? And who are listening and thinking, how would I hold my history? How do I begin to look at this? Any one of you can jump in.
I'm happy for Sonya or Una to say what they'd like.
Sonya.
I mean, I think one of the things that was a huge piece for me, and it came in within the last couple of years, is that there's a dignity in allowing our guilt to be witnessed. There's a real dignity in it. And I was really terrified to approach some of this material from the view of a white person. Whiteness isn't a neutral identity. Like, we know how this culture is built up even when we're inside it. Parts of it are kind of secretive and slippery. And I think that the work that anti-racism education has been doing is really important. But there's a lot of whiteness that likes to feel belonging in what's faultless. Right? We like to identify that way. So the piece of it for me that I think Lisa brought, that I think working in community brought, that I think the writing and the research brought to me, is that I had this misperception in my family that was, if I was going to belong, I couldn't tell the truth. It probably goes way, way back when I was a wee little girl that this happened. But nevertheless, it existed inside me, and it prevented me from really talking about the truth of this situation, in asking questions, in allowing some of the white male historian for me to have deference towards him, and say, oh, well, your view must be the right way. And I just tossed those research boxes in the garage and didn't think about it for years and years. So I think that when I came to the realization that in my family, this is so personal, in my family, that I could both tell the truth and belong, it cracked my world open. And then I could come to this material and see it differently. I could see the injustice that was apparent, and I could see how belonging and whiteness are really pretty solidly linked in many ways. We belong out of that identity, and then we need to find ways to break that down for ourselves. And I think that's an individual perspective. Our family is now talking about these subjects, but not just my children and my husband and I, but extended family. We're thinking about reparations work. I mean, I hate to even put just a few things on the table because it's really a huge project that will take the rest of my life.
Right. Well, and I think it's so important to look at I think that for a long time, white people belonging and race didn't go together. They didn't understand that they had to own their own, we have to own our own identities around it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And that, the work ripples out, as you're saying, just even inside your own family, the work is rippling out beyond you.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And, you said earlier, I had to be embodied. I had to slow down. I had, and that slowing down, that being embodied, that staying with your experience long enough to get grounded so that you could do the work that then could ripple out beyond you.
Yes.
Right. It's
so important. It's not a matter of being the educator. It's not that at all. It is about meeting other people in my family and in my community who are doing this human work already, who are in it in their own ways. We all just have different places that we get stuck in it. So it just, like, to me, the fact that we wrote these essays were about being honest and being vulnerable and putting a process down that might help someone else go about their own process, but it's not about being an educator in this work. I would run from that.
Great.
No.
If I can jump in here, I'd like to address what you asked about going forward. I think Gretchen, Sonya said it beautifully, so I have nothing really to add there. But going forward, I think it's important to keep asking questions and seeking larger truths with a capital T. I'm soon to become a grandmother, and which means that my daughter and her sister and our son-in-law are soon to become ancestors.
Right.
So, what are the responsibilities of ancestors? How do we role model? How do we teach the children well, as the song goes? So, if your parents, your grandparents, your aunts and uncles are still alive, then I encourage you to sit down with them and to ask them questions about their lives before you were born. And to do it, if you can, over time. So not just one conversation, but over a period of time, because like bread and yeast, it takes time to rise.
That's brilliant.
And to record it, to record what they tell you as a gift to the next generation. Because, we live in a culture of 280 characters on a screen, and communication is very fleeting these days. And many of these family stories are getting lost. And once they're gone, they're gone. So I think that's a big thing for me, is to pass it on and to encourage other people to do so, to be aware of it. Because when I was writing this book, the number of people who said to me, gosh, I wish I'd asked these questions of my parents when they were still alive. But you don't think about it when you're younger, because you've got other things. You're living your life, you're building a life. So that would be my parting words, I think. Yeah.
Well, I'm really struck by the conversations that you could have with your family, essentially the ancestors that exist in your world, that connect to this crucible that we were talking about earlier, that that the connections to your story that are part of your actual story and not just the larger communal story, have a different kind of power. Right? And you have a different power to change that story for the future generations.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, great advice. Everybody's going to go run home and start interviewing.
That would be great. That would be a really wonderful thing for this project, to catalyze lots of interviews with elders. Really.
I think here in England, it's done a lot, young children, primary school children, but also secondary school children, go into retirement communities and interview people, which is great. but I'm not sure how much of it's done with regard, in their own families, perhaps because of all the things we've been discussing, the shame, the things that we don't want to talk about. But children, they really get it. They really get it. And they can pick up just from way down deep. If something is said, they can follow the thread down to its root. So, yeah.
Great. What about you, Lisa? What do you, where are you sitting with this project now, and what do you want to take forward?
Well, I'm just really glad that the book is out. The timeline for this project has been a rather short and intense one. So yeah, I'm just really glad that we're at this place in the process. I also am thinking about, with the question, that the fact that this conversation is actually the beginning in a series of online conversations that we'll be having this kind of a format with the rest of the essayists over the next 2-3 months, because what everybody has written is so rich and offers so much. We didn't want to pack, a dozen, 12, 13 of us in one conversation. So so that's with me a lot, and that's I'm excited about that. I'm excited that tonight is the first in a series of 6 online gatherings like this, where each essayist gets to do what Sonya and Una are doing here this evening. So past that, I have no idea. I mean, I feel the same as many of us do in this time we're living in, that's where there's a fair bit up in the air and it's hard to plan. So I have my own version of that, and I just trust, I'll know what the next step is after this project. It feels significant because of what it is and because of the time that we're living in. Yeah, the soul has its own clock. And we didn't know. I mean, it was a year ago that the idea for it came, and so my linear left brain didn't know all that would be happening at this point. And it is. So the idea of unpacking whiteness seems to have caught on. And so it feels like a good idea to be present to the possibilities with that, for this project to be of service in a way that really does. I mean, it's true. What I said is true. If this project catalyzed everybody interviewing their grandparents, that would be terrific. Right. That would just be, wouldn't that go a long way toward helping us? Remember again everything that we're talking about that has to do with really our shared humanity, because just about every circle I lead, one of the things that I say is there are no children without grandparents. And it is absolutely something that in American culture, we have absolutely forgotten. So there's a lot of evidence for that. Looking at the systems of elder care we've set up is one of them. And so, so we get to remember our humanity, and that, so family, it's exciting to me that we take the opportunity this time that we're living in. It's filled with a tremendous amount of opportunity.
One takeaway is this connection to our elders and real and deeper conversation with them. And I think another big takeaway is our connection to our own stories. I would encourage, I'm hoping that finding ways to use this book that has people read it and then attempt their own. Write your own essay about your history in connection to race, to colonialism, to power, to however you hold hierarchy, privilege. Begin to write your story. And I think for most of us, it would take a number of runs at that essay to figure it out, because our stories are myths to start with. right? And we have to sort of sort through to find our truths. So I think it would be a really great, your essays, I think, really will help people try to make that happen for themselves and have the courage to try.
You know, I really appreciate you saying that, Gretchen, and I want to say that to highlight the fabulous job that all the essayists have done here. You know, a lot of white people don't think that they have a story about whiteness, and that's how we got here.
Right.
And so the expectation has been on people who are considered not white, and that is a movable definition. You know, if we look at many of the story, these essays illustrate that. It's a moving target who's white.
Right.
Because it's a made up idea.
Right. It's a social construction. So
yeah.
Right. Well, we have about 15 minutes left and we wanted to leave some time for questions. So wondering if there were questions in the Q&A for the panelists.
Yes, I have a question from Monica. She says, wow, the project was done in 10 weeks. That's intense. How do you think the time frame affected the writing and the outcome?
Sonya or Una, anything you want to say about that before I say something?
Well, yeah, this is writing that I've been doing for probably 3 years now, writing and research that I was doing for 3 years before I came to the project. I didn't know what it was going to turn into exactly, but I already had a relationship with the writing. Writing is my form of understanding what's happening. So I don't need to do it for something or for a project in order for it to be transformational in my life. But it definitely was a crucible of awareness and rapid growth, self-understanding, self-compassion. And the meetings that Lisa did, you know, 1 or 2 a month, I think that we were having during that time, maybe 2 a month, were so necessary for me to just keep my feet on the ground with other women who were doing the same thing. We didn't read our stories until the end either. So that's another interesting part. So our view was on our own work and our own family histories at the same time as we were supporting each other and talking about kind of collective issues in relationship to whiteness. And then at the end, it was exhilarating to read each other's essays and see what shape that we had made in those 10 weeks.
Great.
Can I just add something quickly here? I think it's really important what Lisa spoke about earlier, that she had a vision, that she woke up one morning, she knew what she wanted to do. She even knew the 12 women she wanted to invite. And I think, to me, that was key. And also that she didn't say, okay, this is what I want you to write about. She just let all of us choose for ourselves what we were going to do. And I think that the organic aspect of that meant that it came together in a way that was, I would, you know, I'm hesitating to use this word, but it was almost miraculous, I think. So it was almost formed before it started, I think. Yeah. So thank you, Lisa.
Yes, you're welcome. Thank you both. And I with the plan at the beginning, I had a clear sense of the timeline of it. So that involved a project timeline too. So everybody knew at the outset, here's what the structure is. Here's our structure. Make a plan, hold it lightly is my motto. So, and we did that. And yeah. And, you know, takes 8 or 9 months to have a baby, and you need about 12, 13 women to put on the job to have it, I guess, is kind of, it was not lost on me that it was about the amount of time of a pregnancy. So there's that too.
Yeah, that's great.
The next question is from Kelly. This is actually for Lisa. Lisa, with constellation work, how do you access the national story family constellations are embedded in and make personal connections to that? She says, I get Sonya had the public hanging she learned about in Owensburg, and Una had the story of her mother and uncle hoarding gold coins. But what's your story? Yes.
So the question is, how do I, can you read the first part of the question again?
Yeah, how do you access the national story family constellations are embedded in and make personal connections to that?
It's a great question, and it's a much longer one than I could answer here. So I'm happy to be in dialogue with Kelly about it if she wants to contact me. What I would say here is that, you know, wherever you go, there you are. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, our national stories, whatever nation that is, are with us wherever we go, just like our family is. Mm-hmm. So it's in the body. And in the States and in the Western world, we are trained to live from the neck up. Mm-hmm. So, you know, and we're trained to think we're really top heavy in that way. So I think of this era we're living in as a really great opportunity to have a spirit-led mind where we can feel our bodies infused with a sense of you know, our spirit and our body, and how that can inform the mind, because there's something in the question that leads me to say, you know, our history is not a problem. And whether that's our personal history, our family history, our national histories, they are not problems to be solved. It's really askew how we think of these things. There's a lot of truth waiting to be acknowledged. If we did that, then we could see straight what's a problem that really does require fixing. But, you know, what's already happened, it's happened. And that is our task right now, is to be in relationship with what has, you know, for all of us, it's a human history. So those are the things that come to mind to say, yeah.
So next question is from Jonina. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name, but it is, how did your families feel about your uncovering all of this and wanting to talk with them about it?
That's a good one. I did a trip to Kentucky to interview many of my living relatives, and to go to archives and libraries and talk to curators and talk to historians. So it's something I was really dedicated to doing as part of the project, and it gave me a key awareness of how I belonged to that family when I did that work. My family, I think, because I wrote a memoir first, I think that they had a little bit more comfort with, she's the writer and she tells stories like this. And so there was more awareness about who I am in that perspective, but it wasn't our larger family story that was being told. I also decided that I was going to tell this story from my perspective primarily, and before I went out and did other research that had to do with all of their stories. That is because my sensitivity is so really tied into wanting to belong to my family first, and enhancing that and enriching those relationships without doing something with them. So the kinds of questions I asked them, I interviewed, you know, cousins and aunts and uncles, and I want to do some more of that too, were things about what their life was like, and what they cared about, and what was hard, and what happened for them. And of course, I also asked them, did they know about this historical incident, and what was their relationship to it? But there wasn't a journalistic desire to get something from it. And I think that matters a great deal. I think the intention and the motivation matters. And I think that my connection to that land, as a child of that land, also really matters to them. Mm-hmm. We are having conversations now that I didn't expect I'd ever have. And that's extraordinary. Yeah.
The piece that I discovered about my uncle being evicted from the Berlin Olympics for refusing to salute Hitler, was a story that came up sort of casually in conversation with a member of the younger generation in my family. And so my generation, not so much, not really, don't really want to talk about it. There's still a sense of, you know, whiteness, I think, in Switzerland is about false innocence and a sense of perfection and wanting to hold on to that. So, yeah, not so much in my own generation. Younger ones are interested, but not,
Yep. What I'm struck by for both of you is the need for compassion, both for ourselves and for our family members as we try to hold these stories, right? Whether we're the one trying to hold it or we're wanting them to hold it and help us with it, and not everybody's on the same timeline, right?
Right.
And then I think it's also the motivation. It's important to see that it's out of love, it's out of protection for the family, protection of the heart, not wanting to shame, you know, not wanting to wash your dirty laundry in the marketplace. You know, in Switzerland, it's just absolutely not the Swiss way. You know, English people more, the Irish side of me also, but for Swiss people, it's very hard. And I think it's important to respect that as well.
Yeah.
And I don't want to shame my family because I love them and I love my country. I'm very proud of being Swiss as well. So yeah, I think that's absolutely true, Gretchen. Yeah.
Yeah.
I have a question from Nancy. How do we authentically seek to accept and heal our roles as perpetrators without putting our whiteness at the center?
That is a great question.
Great question.
Can you ask it again, Summer?
How do we authentically seek to accept and heal our roles as perpetrators without putting our whiteness at the center?
Oh. I would suggest that this is, again, has everything to do with why I said yes to this project. I mean, it was my idea, but it was kind of not my idea. I listened to what the idea was, and I had to think about it for 3 months or so about whether to say yes to doing it. And one of the reasons I did was because, again, it has everything to do with family. So the question, I guess I want to invite us to all remember how much in American culture and in the Western world, we put so much emphasis on the individual. And it's just not natural. You know, our humanity is absolutely in relationship. And the first place that begins is in our families. So if we direct so the answer for me, I would say to that question is to direct our attention to the families and ancestries that we come from. Because when we do that, that's also the answer to the question. The reason that the title of the book is Whiteness is Not an Ancestor is because whiteness is not an ancestor. So, I mean, I just say a little bit about this in the book, that was a phrase, like 10 years ago, that phrase came to me. And I use it, I just found myself using that in my work a lot in the groups that I lead. And the phrase it was good medicine. That phrase seemed to be good medicine for people. And when I gathered this group together to write this book, and it came time to pick the title, the writers kept bringing it up. It wasn't my idea to have that be the title of this book. The writers said, we think this is the title we should pick. And then we landed on the subtitle. That to me is, again, it says what this project has been about, which is about family. So we really need to remember that family and our humanity has existed a lot longer than the idea of whiteness. So it's had a long run, and it's had a really big impact, whiteness has. But it's really possible to shift it. And this project, I think, is proof of that.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I would say that you can't change the past, but you can recognize how the past impacts the present. And if we choose to ignore what we know to be true, and we even invented truth about our families, then the unacknowledged guilt, which maybe we could call whiteness, tends to bleed down through the generations and is experienced by later generations as well, it's certainly unease, discomfort, and sometimes even disease. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Anything you want to add, Sonya?
Alongside this work, I had a great anti-racism educator, Elgin Lease Pike from Where Change Started, who I talk about in the essay. She made me very aware that I was going to make mistakes around my whiteness ongoing.
Mm-hmm.
And to find ways to effectively work with the shame. And that allows me to write and allows me to continue to talk and be with the awarenesses that come out of the work and to learn.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Right. We need to find ways. Sonya, you spoke pretty eloquently about essentially decentering whiteness from the story that your family had, taking the camera lens off the victim and putting it on the perpetrator, right? And sort of recentering, if maybe not decentering whiteness, but recentering it around the actual role in that story.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's part of the answer to this question. I don't know that there isn't one answer yet, but I think that part of it is really helping ourselves have conversations and own our responsibilities, and what it means to connect to whiteness, and then to Lisa's point, and what does that mean for our culture? What does whiteness mean, and how do we hold that?
And how does it permeate everything? When I'm watching the news, how is this whiteness? When I'm looking at social media, how is this whiteness? When I'm in the publishing industry, like something about as simple as complex as putting a book out, how is this whiteness? So it's just permeating everything, but I think we get accustomed to thinking that's the normal,
Mm-hmm.
instead of having a different view of what's happening in front of us.
Mm-hmm.
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 I believe we're out of time.
I think we are.
Yeah, this has been so lovely. And as you said, Lisa, this is a beginning, right?
Mm.
This is the end of this conversation and the beginning of many more. So I want to thank you all for your writing, for your generosity of hard work that you've brought to everybody else, and for the chance to be with you tonight.
Thank you, Gretchen.
Thank you, Gretchen. Thank you, everyone in the audience. Thank you for being such a big part of it.
Thank you to everybody. There's 65, 67. There are many things happening in the chat room. Mm-hmm. I'm very excited to read them and see them.
And thank you to all our fellow essayists too, who I think are in the audience. Big shout out to them.
Yes, big shout out, and and thank you to Summer for holding the Zoom fort down. And we're gonna close with there's this slideshow where it's just a few sentences from each essayist that I wanted to make sure everybody had a chance to see those people who are gathered here tonight, but also who watch the recording, that they get a little taste of what each person has written. Great. So Summer, if you want to take us there, that'd be great. Thank you to everybody.
And just to let everybody know, there's a question about buying the book. If you go to the website, Center for Ancestral Blueprints. It will have details for, you can get them from the usual suspects, but Elliott Bay Bookstore is our sponsor this evening. We'd love it if you're in America, if you buy from them. And in Canada and the UK, you can call up your indie bookstore and they will probably have it in connection with Ingram. But also just be in touch with Lisa and the Center for Ancestral Blueprints. The next event is probably November 20th.
November 18th.
Oh, November 18th. Yes. So look for information. We're everywhere.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you. And thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks again to Elliott Bay for sponsoring this event, just backing up. Thank you so much, Sonya. Thank you.